morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second session in the webinar series on publishing agricultural development research in social science journals, co-organized by the CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, or PIM, the CGIAR Standing Panel on Impact Assessment, or SPIA, and AWARD, the African Women in Agricultural Research and Development programs. My name's Ruth Meinzendick. I'm a senior research fellow at IFPRI and a co-leader of a flagship under PIM, and it's my great pleasure to open this webinar. This is the second session, as I mentioned. In case you missed the first session on an overview of the publication process, you can find a recording, slides, and a podcast version on our PIM website where you signed up for this webinar. While you're there, you can sign up for our third webinar next Monday on how to do and respond to peer reviews. Today's session is titled Advice from Journal Editors, and we're very lucky to have a great panel of editors who will discuss what they look for in submissions, how to avoid the desk rejections, and how to handle reviews, proofing, publicizing articles. It's my great pleasure to introduce our chair, Dr. Travis Lippert, Professor of Agriculture and Resource Economics at University of California, Davis, SPIA Special Initiative member, and a former editor of the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. With his background in both publishing and editing and teaching the publication process, he's really very well equipped to help facilitate this panel among such a great group. I'm going to turn it over to you, Travis.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth, and good morning. I'm going to quickly introduce each of our panelists. One thing I'll give you just a minute to do, just because in these virtual interactions, I feel like it's nice to have some grounding of where people are sitting. So I'll lead that pattern and say I'm sitting in California. It's dark and cold outside by California standards, but that means it's just below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But our first panelist, as you see on the screen there, is Elizabeth King, Managing Editor of Journal of Development Effectiveness, non-resident senior fellow, Global Economy and Development Center for Universal Education at Brookings Institute. Elizabeth, it's great to have you on the panel. Can you tell us where you're sitting and give us a local weather report?
Thank you very much, Travis. I'm happy to be here, and thank Ruth for inviting me, and you as well. I'm in Washington, D.C., where it's cloudy and rainy, and it's about 50 degrees. So it's actually warmer than where you are, Travis.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next panelist is Lawrence Clerks, Professor of Agri-Food Innovation and Transition in Wageningen University, Editor of Agricultural Systems, Editor-in-Chief, Journal of Agricultural Education and Extension, and Associate Editor of Agronomy for Sustainable Development. Lawrence, it's great to have you on the panel. Give us a local weather report, where you're sitting and what your local weather is.
Well, I'm sitting here in my living room in Wageningen, and we're still working from home. It's better to sit inside than outside. It's fairly chilly. I can't do Fahrenheit, but it's about 4 degrees Celsius outside, and it's raining a bit, dark. You know, November weather. Typical November weather for the Netherlands.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good to have you. And then finally, Ashok Mishra, Professor of Agribusiness at the Carey School of Business at Arizona State, Editor-in-Chief at Agricultural Economics, and Editor of the Journal of Agribusiness and Developing and Emerging Economies. Ashok, where are you sitting and what's your local weather report?
So I'm in my office here in Mesa, Arizona. It's about 55 degrees. It's 1 hour ahead of your clock, Travis. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to a good session. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining. and for those local weather reports. I like weather, and I like sort of picturing where people are. It helps a little bit to make this this engagement a bit more real. So we're gonna start with just a couple of logistical notes before we dive into discussion. This is for the benefit of those attending. We do want to make this as interactive as we can, and the way we'll do that is by having you submit questions. You'll submit the questions via the question window on the right side of your screen, and you can do that at any point in the discussion. So we're gonna hit a series of topics. I'll kind of guide the discussion. When you submit a question, let us know where you are and your organization. And if the question is directed to one of the panelists, please indicate that in the question window. We will answer those questions in batches, I think, as we go throughout the discussion. I'll be kind of watching those as they're curated, and I'll introduce them at points that seem to make sense and seem to kind of fit the flow of the discussion here. And lastly, we are recording this session, and the recording after this panel concludes, the recording will be available on the PIM website as a future resource, or for those who weren't able to attend the live panel. So with that, let's dive in. I sort of have 4 blocks of questions that we'll walk through. The first round will be questions, kind of fairly basic questions about about you as editors and how you interact with the journal and maybe other co-editors or associate editors. Then we'll talk about submissions and resubmissions, how you handle submissions, resubmissions. Then we'll get into some other details, some kind of behind the scenes in the way that you make decisions and make editorial decisions, how you interact with referees, how you use referee reports. And then if we have time, there's a few kind of higher order questions that we might get to. But let's start with those basic questions. So what we'll do is we'll go in the order that we introduced you, and just have each of you take 90 seconds or so and give us a feel for the journal that you edit. That is, what features of the articles that you publish do you feel like really kind of characterize the journal, to make it kind of distinctive relative to the sort of other journals? So Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Travis. First of all, I wanted to mention that the editor-in-chief of the Journal for Development Effectiveness is Manny Jimenez, and I'm the managing editor. So the aim of our Journal of Development Effectiveness, is, as the title says, it's all about understanding the impact of programs, policies, projects, and we do this by publishing high-quality research that examines the evidence of the impact of these projects or policies. And we're not wedded to one particular evaluation method. So we encourage a mix of methods, or choosing different methods to get at the impact of policies and projects. We also realize that sometimes impact is not positive. Projects don't necessarily have a positive impact, and that's not that doesn't make a difference for us. The idea is whether the impact is positive or negative or no impact. We want to understand why that is. So let me stop there.
Excellent. Lawrence.
Yes, for me it's a bit complicated because I'm connected to several journals. So for today I'll keep agronomy for sustainable development out of the equation. I only have a minor role there. So I'll talk about the other 2 journals I'm involved with. So the first one is the Journal of Agricultural Education and Extension. I'm actually a co-editor together with IFPRI's own Kristen Davis. We should not forget to mention that. So we're doing it really together, and then we have a whole team of editors who also help us process all the submissions. And the Journal of Agriculture, Education, Extension, yeah, we look at education and extension processes in agriculture. So we publish a whole range of qualitative and quantitative studies which have to do with the impact of extension interventions, it has to do with agenda setting for education, it has to do with policies for extension. So it's a quite broad range of studies we publish, but we do want to see that extension theories are well applied and advanced. That is very important. So we aim to move the state of art ahead, and that is different from some extension journals which focus more on practical studies and are much more focused on practice. We do value that theory, but in a sense it's a very interdisciplinary journal. The other journal I'm connected to, that's of more recent date in the position of editor, is Agricultural Systems, and that is a very diverse journal looking at system studies in agriculture. So there you have had the more agronomy type studies, you have systems modeling studies, some stuff much more on the biophysical element, other stuff more on socioeconomics. And there I handle more the socioeconomic studies. So I get sometimes adoption studies, but they also need to have like this systems component. I get agricultural innovation system studies, which I handle. And for that journal, it's really important that this connection between socioeconomic systems thinking and biophysical systems thinking is quite strong. So that kind of characterizes the two different journals.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Ashok.
Okay, thank you, Travis. So I'll talk more about the agricultural economics journal that I lead, and the one that Jade is the agribusiness part of it, which I started a while back. It's growing a little bit. So the main pitch is coming from agriculture economics, but you can translate that into Jade also with the focus on agribusiness. So in agricultural economics, we publish papers that are applied economics that has good sound theory and application. And we publish papers in all fields of agriculture economics, from futures options to development to policy, insurance, anything that you can think about. We do all those kind of papers in our journal.
Excellent, very good. And I'll say, you know, Ruth introduced me as the former editor of the AJAE, and I feel like I'll just give a little bit of a pitch on AJAE. So we, much like Ashok, the AJAE actually looks at a pretty broad swath of papers and representing a lot of different subfields. And she mentioned former editor. I actually am down to, technically my tenure ended about a year ago, but I still have four submissions left that I'm trying to push out the door. So one of the things that editors appreciate more than anyone else is sort of the team of members, associate members, and editors that publishers. There's really a whole machine that runs behind the scenes that makes these editors function. And I think it would be good actually to just hear a little bit about that kind of behind the scenes, how you in each of those journals, how you organize the workflow, how you interact with other editors. Elizabeth mentioned an editor-in-chief, sort of what those relationships look like, and what, if anything, a submitting author ought to know about the structure prior to submitting to a journal like yours. So we'll do the same. We'll go in the same order this time. Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you. So so I'm probably been with the journal, the kind of more recent than the other colleagues on this panel. But I was on another journal for more than 5 years, so I sort of have the views from where I am right now, where I've been, which has been over almost 2 years now. So I guess that's not that new. But also in terms of how, you know, an editor-in-chief sort of interacts with other with managing editors and associate editors. So in our case, in the Journal of Development Effectiveness, the editor-in-chief who receives all submissions then assigns the submissions to the editor. So There are also associate editors and editorial boards. So if we are not, that's not our, let's say, a particular topic is not my particular expertise, then the paper would probably go to somebody else. So we kind of do that, but we all are, each editor, I know that my recommendation to publish or reject a paper is likely to be the decision. If there was some kind of a debate about a paper or about a decision, we would probably, and the debate is pretty close, then the editor-in-chief will probably make the decision. Otherwise, it's really the handling editor who makes the decision about a rejection or an acceptance or major revision, minor revision, etc. So that's kind of how we do the flow. The main one thing that I wanted to say, I should have said earlier, is that the key criterion for even getting a paper to review is whether there's a credible counterfactual to, you know, for the program or policy that's being evaluated. If there's no such counterfactual, if there's no credible one, and the authors did not bother to actually say something about that, that's a clear desk rejection from all of us.
Very good. And how many managing editors do you have?
So as far as I know, there's just me and essentially the editor-in-chief, who sort of acts as a managing editor as well.
Okay.
It's the journal is 10 years old, and so I don't know if that's definitely younger than your former journal, Travis.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you, Lawrence.
Yes. So for the Journal of Agricultural Education Extension (JAE), I'm one of the editors-in-chief. So the workflow is that we have an editorial assistant who receives all the manuscripts and divides them between Kristen Davis and myself. And then we have a first look at them. And during that round, I desk reject all those submissions which are poorly prepared. So either they're not in line with the aims and scope of the journal, or they are a very nice study but not well embedded within the broader debates in the journal. So they can be really nice study on a particular region somewhere in the world, but they don't show what they add to the broader literature. That's also a reason for desk rejection. But for those studies that pass that first screening, so they do show this is what we aim to contribute, they articulate well the contribution, then we move them on to the handling editors. We have 6 with JEE, also to keep the workload manageable for all the different persons involved. So then I assign based on the different capabilities of the editors. They have a specific expertise. So there's an editor who's better versed with quantitative approaches. I assign a lot of quantitative work to that editor. I also look at regions. So we try to have a balanced distribution. We have somebody from Latin America, somebody from Africa, a couple of people from Europe, also an editor from Asia. So also that matters in terms of how we assign the papers. Obviously, the workload needs to be manageable. So if they already have a high number of assignments, sometimes it might end up with another editor, which is not from a specific region. And basically, then these people, they do the whole sending out for review. They assess the review reports and they give me an advice. And then I will look at their advice. I sometimes will have another look at the paper, might add a bit of extra advice or recommendations. And then typically I follow their decision. And for agricultural systems, I'm in kind of the handling editor position. So there I get manuscripts assigned from Val Snow, who's the editor-in-chief, who does basically the same as I do for JEE. So she filters out all those submissions which do not meet basic quality criteria and sends them on to me. If there's doubt, we can also discuss it. I also have the liberty to say, no, this is not good enough. I also will desk reject or I will send it back for further work. But typically, all the paper C assigns to me, I will look for reviewers in the area to get them reviewed. Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Ashok.
Okay, so in agricultural economics, my co-editor Avudu, who's in Germany, he gets up earlier than me, so he he gets to assign papers. So he takes half of the stock, I take the other half. And what I do is basically go through each paper and read the first couple of pages, look at what contributions and what's the objective. And right away, 65% of the papers are rejected in that case. They may not have strong contribution, if bad writing, whatever it is, it goes out the door. If I have a conflict of interest in that particular scenario, when I get the paper, I assign it to my associate editors. So we have about 15 to 20 associate editors, a good composition of male, females around the world you can talk about, and they are experts in their fields and who want to serve and have served very well for us. So they will take over the paper, then they can decide what they want to do with that, either read the paper and then decide it's good enough to go out and get reviews. They will do that. Otherwise, they write a letter to me saying these are the things and we need to reject it. So I'll do that from there. So like this year, we already have 850 submissions. So our acceptance rate is about 8%. One of the questions that was, in a sense, how much stock should the authors put in the makeup of the associate editors or something like that? I think that's, in our journal, that's kind of irrelevant because like I said, it's a wide distribution of articles, topics, areas of expertise, and those kind of things. So the one thing I strongly recommend to each of these authors is to write a fantastic paper, the best paper they have written, and go from there.
Yeah, Ashok, that's a great point. And it's a good it's an excellent bit of advice for especially for junior scholars thinking about writing papers. I know that we all, you know, when you're looking at submitting a paper to a journal, it is tempting to kind of pour over the editorial board and imagine how this editor or that editor might respond to the paper, and we have this kind of vision that they have kind of predisposed preferences that would either, you know, favor or disfavor your paper. But Ashok, I think you're exactly right. I think that sort of gamesmanship doesn't get you very far. What does is writing good papers and like really focusing on the quality of writing so my personal experience at AJAE, the structure is a little bit like what Ashok just described at agricultural economics. So we have 4 co-editors, and we handle, there's a little bit of a process for divvying up submissions across the 4 co-editors. And then we kind of rely on a board that includes about 30 or 32 associate editors, and we kind of rely on them as reviewers, but also as, like, you know, kind of tiebreakers, or if there's some complexity, or so we do use those associate editors. But Ashok, that's very good. That's very good advice. The next question I have for each of you is sort of how you envision your role as an editor. And partly this question is like, this is of interest to me because it's something that as editor, you kind of have to feel your way on, and it's not something, I guess, you know, how you see your role as an editor might evolve as you serve in your editor position, or as you kind of go to different, you know, serve with different journals. But there's some editors I know are fairly hands-off, and they feel like their role is to sort of manage a process and really manage and moderate kind of this academic or scholarly exchange between reviewers and the authors. And as long as they kind of guide that in the right way, you know, they trust that the outcome is going to be the kind of the peer-reviewed outcome is going to be better for it, right? And there's sort of these editors that think of just mediating that exchange. There are other editors, I think, who almost become kind of ghost authors on papers and become very involved in suggesting how to, you know, restructure the paper, and it's not just like kind of arm's length moderating a dialogue with reviewers. So I'd be curious just to hear you reflect on sort of how you see in that spectrum, kind of where you think you are and why you function that way as an editor. Elizabeth?
So I think the editor-in-chief is a mediator and also a somebody who's going to assign the papers. But then our editor-in-chief also serves as a sort of a managing editor, and so I'm one of the managing editors, and that means to say more. I think I do more than just kind of manage the flow of reviewers. And I think as I've grown into the role, and my role in a past previous journal, I also played more the role that probably what you would call guest author almost. And that's really because we want to encourage new authors. And young authors don't necessarily know how to publish, right? And especially if these are authors from countries where the research community is not very well developed. And we want to have this, our journal is about development. And so we want to encourage submissions from authors in developing countries. And so many of them are not native English speakers, so definitely sort of grammatical issues are it's something that we have to manage. But the other thing is just getting submissions from researchers who are relatively young researchers. So in that case, I tend to say, well, it looks like your paper is actually a much better paper than what you are sort of doing with it. And you can tell if the data sets are good, if the questions are good, the theory, the placing the research into the debate, the important debates, those are kind of important, and young authors don't necessarily always know how to sell their papers. So that's something that I feel is when I spot an author who sort of sounds like a young author, right? Then I go into that mode a bit of guiding more the presentation of the paper. And then there are those, of course, that just nothing there, not much in the way of exposition, not much in the way of the quality of the analysis. And those ones, I don't have to spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, good. Lawrence.
Yes, I would say in my case, it differs a bit from paper to paper. I won't say that I ever will take the complete ghost author role because I don't have time for it. So it's just I don't have the time to go through each paper and then give very detailed comments. I also think, also in the case of young authors, that it's the responsibility of their supervisors or their collaborators. So it's also important to discuss these issues in a team. When is a paper mature? When can you send it, for example? But yeah, it depends a little bit on the quality of the reviews. If the reviews are really good and also are in line with each other, you can basically say, follow the reviews and I won't interfere much. Or the handling editor won't give a lot of comments. If the reviews are contrasting, you might say, yeah, I see kind of contrasting views, but try to pick this and this up, or pay more attention to this and this. There you also give your own opinion. Obviously, it requires that you read the paper, and it needs to be a paper where you can actually say something. You can't do that with all papers because we also have our own biases and our own weaknesses. I'm not an expert in all areas. So basically, yeah, it differs a bit. What I also see as the task of an editor is protecting authors from evil reviewers. I do find that reviewers need to write well founded comments, also in a friendly manner. I haven't seen this that much yet myself, but I've seen it also with my colleagues. For example, reviewers who just push their own citations without any further explanation. I will keep them out. I don't tolerate that, and I will send them a message that it's not appropriate behavior. That citation pushing, it's just not ethical. Also, yeah, if they have a unfriendly tone, I might say, don't take it as harsh. But that also would require a response to the review to say, please next time write it in a different way. We're not here to give each other's bad feelings. We're here to raise the quality of science, and it can also be done in a constructive way. So in that sense, I go a little bit more towards like not the ghost author role, but a little bit more an actively intervening editor. But it really also depends on the quality of the reviews, and sometimes also the handling editor takes care of it, and then I don't need to do much. So it varies from case to case.
Yeah, excellent. That you raise a really good point that you know, and I think all of us would agree, I'm sure, in our kind of editorial roles, that you know our goal really is to publish the best papers we can, and sort of how we get there is this peer review process that's not always linear, and it's sometimes it is contentious, and so the editor is kind of moderating in that dialogue. But that the role that we sometimes play as mediator, it really can, in the end, it can improve the quality of the final product, right? And Lawrence, you make that point really well, that it's like picking good reviewers, you know, and just as we'll get to a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about reviewers maybe later in the conversation, but you know, it is clearly in the best interest of editors to line up the very best reviewers that we can on a given paper, right? I mean, so sometimes I think authors feel like the selection of reviewers is somehow it's the whole process is kind of tipped against them in some way. It biased against accepting the paper, but it's clear that the best peer review process is one that includes a good submission, but also really thoughtful reviewers. And sometimes the way the reviewers actually handle a paper is very much kind of a reflection of the direction they get from the editor, and so that's a really good point that you raise. Ashok.
Okay, so in the case of agricultural economics, so I serve as a mediator between authors and reviewers. So we do the same thing like Lawrence talked about or Elizabeth talked about. We just go back and forth between the reviewers and the authors, and if there is some kind of grudges against the reviewer or author, sometimes the reviewer will say, oh, I have seen this paper in the previous journal and the authors did not take my advice or something like that. So people need to be careful in that case, because authors would take a paper rejected by AJE and directly repackage it and send it back, say, okay, send it to AE International, but authors don't know what is the highest probability of getting the same reviewer again, and so in that cases, we have to kind of intervene and said, hey, you already did this thing before, and I'm sorry, or you need to go back and redo and then resubmit it in a sense. So that kind of things can take place. But I also do a ghost editor co-authorship, like Elizabeth was saying, with my newer journal, Jade, where most of the paper comes from developing and emerging economies, where I look at it and say, yeah, the topic is good, the hypothesis is good, the writing is bad, or they haven't formatted to the journal style, whatever it is. So I try to unsubmit that thing back to them and say, hey, you need to find somebody to co-author with, or somebody to write with you, or some senior person who can help you do that. I like the paper. I will take it later on if you resubmit it in the right format with good English, make it perfect, and I have done that in that journal. I hold a lot of hands, just because knowing the audience and knowing where the authors are from, I do that much more in that journal. But in any way, I would just tell all these authors, all these young economists who are working, just submit the best work and at the best time. Don't hurry in anything. You may publish one less paper, but it should be the best paper you published, in a sense. Very good.
So we're getting a number of questions submitted, which is great. So we appreciate those. So we'll change it up a little bit. Instead of doing kind of a round robin with each of you kind of offering thoughts on a given question, we may bounce around a little bit more, and I may direct some of these questions specifically to one or another of the panelists. One of the questions we got, Ashok, I'll direct to you, was based on, this is a question from Nayu, which is based on a question you asked, or that you a statement you made about looking for contribution to the field. And part of this question is also kind of, I guess, about theory and empirics. So maybe you can just reflect a little bit more on what you look for that kind of defines contribution to the field, and how important theory versus empirics in a paper are in the way that you make that assessment.
So let me get back to the theory versus the empirics kind of thing. So if you are going to analyze a particular problem, you need to establish that there is a theoretical correlation, what you're looking at, and then move from there to saying, okay, this is what I'm going to test in Indonesia, looking at the palm oil industry, whatever it is. So once you have established that right in first 2 pages, that can really get me and say, nowadays is much more common to say, here are the contributions of this paper to the literature, saying A, B, and C, and I can then read through those couple of pages and say, yeah, that really makes, because in that 2 pages where you're citing saying, this is what I'm trying to test, and this is my theory, this is my link to the empirics, I'm looking at link to the literature that is, so you have established that you're pushing the envelope a little bit further out and saying, this is the contribution. So establishing the, because just running a regression, showing something like that will not cut it in the new, we are all looking for a very small space to publish. And with all thousands of journals and thousands of reviewers out there who are reviewing paper daily in and out, the sounding board has to be, when you start writing paper or when you start doing an experiment, see, so how is it different than Mishra did it in 1997? Or how is it different than DuPont did it in 1938, something like that? So ask that question and then try to establish one step at a time, theory, empirics, and then discussions and conclusions and those kind of things.
Yeah, good, good. Let me broaden it to Elizabeth and Lawrence. Do either of you have a reflection on what contribution to the field means in the way that you operationalize that at your respective journals?
I said earlier that discussing the credible counterfactual is a key, it's a key criterion for even looking at a paper, right? So, and in some cases, and also another would be that it's not exactly the same sort of a repeat of an impact evaluation of exactly the same treatment only in this country. So rather than so it has to have, it cannot just be about here's another country with exactly the same program or same policy and we're now applying the same method. And sometimes I think some researchers do think that if they just change from country A to country B, that would be a contribution. We do, just like what Ashok was saying, that we do want the paper to be much more reflective about the debates, the broader debate about why does something work or not work? Why does a program or policy work or not work? So it has to have that. It has to be much more a reflection of how the development process takes place. So if it can do that and give us, in addition to the statistical sort of quality of the piece, it has to also be able to move the thinking about the field forward. Now, I can do that for some of the fields that I know, but of course, I don't always know. I don't know that because we are much more multi-sectoral rather than multidisciplinary. It's multi-sectoral. So I might get something on agriculture or get something in macro or something else. So we will assign those papers to the appropriate editors. But the key point is always, do you have a credible counterfactual, and are you moving the understanding about that particular sector forward?
Mm-hmm. Good. Lawrence, any other reflections on contribution to the field?
No, I really echo Elizabeth. It needs to advance the debate. So each paper needs to have, by the end of its introduction, a problematization. What is it, what we do not know? How does this move the thinking in an area forward? So I get a lot of studies, needs assessment of agricultural education students in this area or that area. It's very fine and it's very relevant as a report, but it doesn't move the debate forward, it doesn't have like a broader relevance for an international audience. So that is also what I always say when I desk reject, because I always give a small reason that I say it's not like irrelevant work, but you don't make it relevant for a broader audience. So you really need to be on top of where is the state of the art and how do you go beyond, and you need to articulate that, and preferably quite rapidly in the paper, and also don't make a new kind of problem statement pop up all over the paper. I want to see it concentrated in one place, and also want to see an answer at the end, so that we know this is what the contribution is. And for doing that, you must know what has been done both in the journal but also an adjacent journal. It's not that we only need citations from the journal, but you do need to show at least I've made an effort to read what is in the journal where I'm sending my work to. And also that I sometimes see papers which clearly have been submitted elsewhere. I think Ashok also mentioned that they have been rejected and then they try another one without thinking. That is not the way to go. Then you will get 20 desk rejects in a row.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it echoes something that came up in the first of these webinars. Was this point that, you know, getting rejected, that happens to everyone, but there's sort of a good and a bad way to respond to a rejection, and the bad way, as hopefully our audience is sort of picking up here, I think all of us have said it in different ways, is the bad way is to just immediately shuffle it off to somewhere else without really thinking about what the reviewer said or what the concern was or what the problems were. And so that's really good advice, right? I mean, the way I always instruct my own kind of advisees, students, is, you know, if you have a revise and resubmit, you know, it's amazing the lengths to which we will go to try to satisfy reviewers. I mean, we'll spend weeks and weeks and weeks working on a paper to try to satisfy a reviewer. But if it's instead a very detailed, thoughtful referee report that ends with a rejection, we're much more likely to be dismissive of the whole thing and just move on and just try to get to that R&R and then say, I'll spend my time revising the paper. And that's definitely the wrong approach, right? I mean, the feedback we get in a rejection can be just as useful, but you kind of it takes a certain meekness or humility to actually like embrace it and say, okay, how am I going to make this paper better? Not just because there's a chance that you draw the same reviewer, right? But because the point of the process is to make the paper better, right? One more question just from the group, this growing set of questions we have from the audience, and this one, Elizabeth, I'll direct to you. And that you mentioned kind of multi-sectoral, that the paper, the submissions you get cover a lot of different sectors.
Mm-hmm.
Do you to what extent do you see mixed methods? I mean, do you get submissions from different fields, more qualitative than quantitative? Like, give us a sense of the range of disciplines or methods that you see at your journal, and how do you sort of evaluate these differently given different standards?
Right. So the current, I guess, thinking about the gold standard in impact evaluation is that you have to have a randomized control trial. And so that's sort of, when people have something like that, they think that's sufficient and they want to submit a paper. But actually it's not sufficient, because in some cases you don't really understand, so why did you get a positive result or no result, right? So you need to, so it would even be better for some of those randomized control trials to actually then enrich that with some qualitative information to try to understand why you're getting what you're getting, right? And why do you want to believe what it is that you're getting? Because in some cases, in impact evaluation, it's also possible to game it, even if it's a randomized control trial. It's possible, right? So you want to understand there might be other reasons other than the program or the treatment that or the intervention you're looking at. So trying to go behind that in terms of the economics or the sociology of why you're seeing what you're seeing. is very important. We would like to see much more mixed methods in general than just sort of a, you know, a blinded way of just looking at whether you've got a treatment or a control in a randomized controlled trial. Because if you want to think about the development process as a whole, you need to think about what a treatment in a certain area of a country, how you think that might actually, what lessons does that hold for the bigger economy or the bigger country? So that is what I mean also by a mixed method, is thinking about how you use what you find from a RCT, what that means in terms of the broader development process.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think for that, you know, researchers can say, okay, we also did some focus group. We also used the bigger data set from the country and look to see, are we, you know, are the results we're getting sort of a strange result, or does it actually resonate with other data and also other literature, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah, good. Lawrence, do you any thoughts on qualitative submissions or submissions that include kind of significant qualitative methods as part of the paper?
You mean in terms of like positioning the paper?
Yeah.
Well, they basically need to articulate, you know, what is the relevance of this case study also for other places. So, for example, if it's about like learning amongst advisors, just to name a topic, and that can be in a certain state of Nigeria, or it can be in Chile, or it can be in China. Then you need to make plausible, we can learn something from this beyond this immediate case. That is what I'm looking for. And that also means that you need to read what have other people done on this topic. You need to position that in your introduction. Then you also need to come up with a good kind of framework to analyze it, and that can be different ways. There's not one framework. It can be a generic framework, or knowledge exchange, tacit knowledge, explicit knowledge, or whatever. So as long as you can show, I've done this with like a rigorous approach, there's a good thinking behind it, then there's quite some diversity possible, and there's a place for work from all around the planet. The JAA and also Agricultural Systems, they publish from all continents, but it needs to meet those requirements that you show we can learn something more broadly. And even if you say the uniqueness is that nobody has ever studied this region, then still you need to show we see that this resembles findings elsewhere. We see the same as has happened maybe in other places, but we also see something special that might be due to this specific location. You need to make that clear, and often that is what submissions then don't do. They don't make that clear. They just say, here are some nice results. And that is also, and I've also noted this as a co-author, as a collaborator, that in some places people don't think about where will I publish this. They just do a study and then they go and think, oh, let's publish it. And nobody's waiting for it. Right. You need to know, is there an audience already at the moment that you execute your study? And I know that in some circumstances this is not easy because you're commissioned to do work. But then also during the process already think, how should I frame this? It's also about framing. And it can even be saying, this is like a study repeating earlier work, because replication has become increasingly important. But I think even then you need to make the case for why do you replicate. Yeah. And that's basically what you need to do in that introduction. Make the case, this paper matters.
Yep. Good. And it is, we do have a question here about, you know, when you're all handling lots and lots of submissions and questions about how do you make an assessment of a paper? Clearly, you don't have time to read hundreds and hundreds of submissions every month, and so there is a certain, so it is sort of, you know, reading the introduction, I mean, my own experience, like I usually tried to read the introduction almost every word, just because it was like the author's opportunity to pitch the paper, and but then beyond that, just kind of like bouncing around a little bit to get a feel. So one question, I'm gonna sort of take a stab at this, at answering a question, and then if any of you want to kind of chime in. We have a question from Gashao Alamu, who's with IFPRI, and he says I'm becoming to believe that rejection acceptance is a matter of chance. Am I right? So my sense from my time editing and as associate editor is that while there is an element, there is sort of some randomness to the process, because there is you know, like who the reviewers are and whether there's a timely review, and you know, one thing that's hard to appreciate until you're an editor is just how much arm twisting it can take with some reviewers to get them to submit a review and on time, and so there's a lot of that going on. So there's an element of randomness in the ultimate outcome of a submission, but I think it's far overwhelmed by what I really think is sort of the deterministic piece, which is like, you know, if you submitted the same paper in a parallel universe 10 times, how many times would it get rejected at AJAE, and how many times would it be accepted? And I think actually those sort of submissions across parallel universes would have a pretty high correlation. I think that the process, my sense is that the process plays out in a way that's reasonably consistent, and I mean, my own sense reflecting on my time is that I actually, my faith in the peer review process was not diminished by being engaged in the process as an editor. I certainly appreciate this kind of, that yeah, sometimes you get a referee report that seems a little bit out there. But the editor, I think an editor actually kind of serves as kind of a moderating influence in those cases. But any reflections on this? Like how much of this peer review process is random versus, like, you know, systematic and deterministic and really kind of pushing towards better publications? That's open. Any thought? Lawrence, you're going to say something.
Yeah, there might be some randomness in it, in terms that sometimes it's just little, you know, details which make you kind of flip towards like desk reject or not. But they're also like you can influence that as an author by maybe writing a very good cover letter, making clear why is this paper of relevance to the journal, so you can kind of determine part of your own fate. Sometimes it also depends on indeed how many submissions, how much possibility is there also to, for example, delegate it to handling editors to do an additional screening. That's what I sometimes do. If I can't really assess it, I pass it on. I ask, screen it first, and you tell me, do I need to desk reject or do you want to process it further? But sometimes, yeah, it depends also on journals. I have an own experience with Agriculture and Human Values. We would have one of the editors on board, but they couldn't make it. And I had two, what I thought, critical assessments, but not like devastating. They were constructive. I would have said major revision. But there it was still a print journal with space limitations, because I wrote kind of an expression of concern. I said, I've seen this now several times, both as a reviewer and now as an editor. I see two perfectly constructive reviews. Why is this being rejected still? And he said, yeah, I have a very limited number. So that also determines it. And some journals, they publish as they go. They don't have like that page limit, etc. So there are all kinds of factors. And some are really just like, yeah, silly factors. They shouldn't play a role, but they nevertheless play a role. And that can be demotivating to authors, but it's the reality editors sometimes have to live with.
Yeah, good. We're going to shift, and I'll kind of be coming back to some of the other questions we have, that we won't get to all of them, but there's some really good questions coming in. But let me shift to a little bit more to the submissions and resubmissions that you handle. And I'll start back with you, Elizabeth, and then go to Ashok. So what kind of words of wisdom do you have for authors in as they prepare a paper for submission. So your journal, probably like all journals, has kind of author guidelines that has some. So you're looking for some specific formatting and some. But based on your experience, are there specific best practices that you see in preparing a paper for submission that you think really facilitate the job of an editor or reviewer, right? What is it that, in terms of how someone writes a paper and how it's structured and how well they adhere to author guidelines, any reflections on the preparing a manuscript for submission?
Right. So in the journal where I'm in right now, I don't see a whole lot of issues with respect to the formatting of the submission. In a former journal, it was the simplest guidelines about formatting, and authors don't follow double space, word count limit, etc. Those are the things that are very, very simple way of just making a paper go through the very basic process of screening, right? So there's a basic screening level, and authors, please do follow the guidelines for those. And then the other would be, of course, some of what you have all said, which is right at the beginning, you need to be able to say, what is this paper about and what is the contribution of this paper to the broader understanding of that topic and other places, right? So that's a second point. And also, I think it helps very much if the authors have in their minds when they're preparing their paper to already know what are the highlights from this paper. So I think if the authors actually organize themselves accordingly, what are the 5 highlights from this paper, then one can actually probably rewrite the introduction of many papers accordingly and make that much more important, much clearer to the reader. The other thing is really also English, the grammatical quality of the writing. And what's interesting is that I've seen papers where the literature review is perfect in terms of grammar and English, and then really horrible discussion of the results and conclusion. And I get the sense, well, you have co-authorships, collaborations, and so the authors did not all read the whole paper in its entirety. And probably after they each got their sections written and somebody put them together and sent them. Or even more insidious suspicion here would be, and that comes to mind, is that it was really there's some possibly plagiarism of the literature review. And then the real authors wrote the rest of the paper. In any case, it's very important to actually have co-authored papers where somebody reads the whole thing, and so you have coherence, not just in the content, but also in the style.
Yeah, excellent. Ashok, any other reflections on preparing a manuscript for submission, and whether that's adherence to author guidelines or maybe writing? You mentioned writing before, kind of the quality of writing, the exposition. Any other advice based on what you've seen?
Well, one of the high points I was going to say is that every paper that I have seen, I've done many journals editing, and now one of the best things I see from Scandinavia, they follow to the point, and I really admire people from Scandinavia doing their job and preparing and everything else. I had one example where somebody from IFPRI, sorry to say that, but somebody just dumped the discussion paper as paper. And there was 80 pages of paper, it's like you look at this thing coming in, I was like, it's mind-boggling. Why would you do that? So take your time to parse out even if it's a discussion paper, take out your time to parse out the paper, put the contribution up front and those kinds of things. So take your time. That's what I was saying. Take your time to do all those things. Don't rush. Don't try to submit. Like I have seen a couple of times, the author has submitted the paper, but the co-authors, like Elizabeth was saying, that the co-author didn't even know they were co-authors. And I said, like, the writing doesn't sound like that you have contributed to this. Oh no, I did not. I don't know why they put my name. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
So be careful in those kind of things. And because as editors, I can follow up with people, whatever it is, in a sense, to find out, because if it doesn't make sense, front part doesn't add up to the back part and something is going wrong, it can be easily be caught. And then that's not a good reflection on you or in the profession, where we try to police these papers coming out and scientific discoveries that are being placed into print. So
good. I'll pick up on that and just share a couple of reflections of my own, as I think this is a really important point that we mentioned earlier, that that this process is not random, and so you could think this, and I think for some young scholars, in fact, I may have been guilty of this as a young researcher. You can have too much faith in the process in a way, and you can think, you know what, all this kind of window dressing of how it's framed and how whether it's a discussion paper, or whether it's a chapter from my dissertation, whether it's written as a paper, that none of that should matter, right? Because the peer review process should really get at like the quality of the contribution, and it should be able to kind of parse that out. That's clearly a naive perspective on papers, right? And so I think the point that you're making, Ashok, that's very good is, take the time to turn it into what looks like a paper. It's very easy as an editor, it's very easy to look at a submission and see that it's essentially a chapter from a thesis, a master's thesis or a PhD, and with not a whole lot of thought to like how writing a paper for submission to the AJAE would look different than writing a chapter for a dissertation. I think that takes a lot of work, right? The reason we get those, I'm sure, and I sort of, we all sort of have this dilemma when you're preparing a paper, which is like, how much work do I put into this before I submit it? Like, how much is good enough? But the point I think that's very important to underscore here is that that the quality, it's really hard to assess the quality of the contribution if it doesn't look in form or in degree of polish like a submission to that journal, right? I mean, that takes some time to kind of push it to that point.
So I just
sure,
want to add to that, Travis.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, the thing I was going to say is, like, even if you pass the first hurdle and say the reviewers don't have time to go back and instruct you how to put it together, because they're reviewing left and right, and they maybe have good intentions, but they read the first 4 pages and said, this is not going to cut it, I'm not going to read it, and they just throw it back. Even so, there are a lot of, like you said, there is randomness, but there is also a lot of people don't have time to do that. So it's incumbent upon you to put your best foot forward.
No, that's right. Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. I mean,
could I add
what I tell my advisees is that, when you submit a paper, everyone who touches that paper is probably overworked and probably doesn't have a lot of time. And so what that means is, everyone who touches it in some way is going to be looking for a reason to reject it, because that makes their life easier, right? That's a little bit cynical, but not so much, because I mean the reviewers are looking to kind of, they have their own papers, so it's good to sort of have in mind that there's not a whole stable of professionals who just wait to get, they just can't wait to get the next submission that they're going to handle. I mean, we're all sort of juggling a lot of things, and so it's good to advocate for the editors and reviewers by how you frame the paper. Lorenz, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, interesting, because obviously we as editors, we are also still reviewers. So if a paper is not kind of structurally well done, you get to the point where you say, do I get myself into trouble if I go detailed? So as an experienced reviewer, I now have kind of a cutoff point. I say, no, this paper, I will do a couple of major points. I won't go into details. And sometimes even out of self-protection, I do that because I know if I go into it, it will cost me 3 rounds and I become almost a co-author. And a reviewer is not a co-author and should not desire to become one. Sometimes also reviewers should not want that, because sometimes they do. So indeed, if you structure well, you get them on board. You make them want to read your paper, and that also includes decent preparation. And now some of the publishing houses, like Elsevier, have it your paper your way. And it's fine for references. I don't care about reference style, to be honest. That people can take care of that later. I do care for the sake of my reviewers, and if I'm a reviewer for my own sake, I want continuous line numbering. I don't want to say on page 3, middle paragraph, I want to say line this, and line 50, this point, line 50 to 55, these points. Make their lives easy. Also in your revision notes, say I did this because of this, there and there in this line. Don't make them guess what you did. Make reviewers' lives as easy as possible. And then you will also get better results as an author often, because it might mean the difference between that they say, oh, gee, this paper, no, I won't do it, or they say, okay, it takes some work, but it's manageable also for me, and I will give good comments because it's easy for me to do so. So that's also preparation.
Yeah, good, good. Question on citation. So earlier, Lorenz, you mentioned citation pushing on the part of reviewers. How important, and maybe Elizabeth, how important is it that submissions cite work that is published in your journal?
Yeah, this is a tricky part, because it needs to be appropriate, and there's ethics involved. And I've also, as an author, I was still a very young author, a victim of coercive citation on part of an editor, basically after acceptance, saying, oh, you're not up to date enough, maybe use some more reference from this and this journal. Happened to be journal that person was part of the editorial board. That's unethical, doing it in that way. But I don't think it's unrealistic and unfair to ask. At least show that you know what this journal is about. So at least, read some of it, and if it's appropriate, cite it, but not citing just for the sake of it. So it needs to be appropriate. And that's also with reviewers. I don't mind reviewers suggesting work, but if they say literature review is incomplete, all these works need to be cited only from the reviewer, that's crossing clearly a boundary of ethical behavior. So it needs to be appropriate. That's, I think, the key word there.
Good, good. Elizabeth, let me ask you one question here.
Just on that one very quickly, it's not important for us. We feel that if the technical quality of the journal is high, then that should be sufficient to bring more scholars to cite the papers in the journal. But it's citing the papers in the journal is not important for us. As Lawrence was saying, however, some reviewers feel that they have to get their papers advertised, etc. Anyway,
so we'll shift gears just a little bit to a question we received from Valerie Senko, a PhD student in Italy, who asks, this is about replication, but I think, Elizabeth, it would be interesting for you to reflect on this. Developing on the use of different case or countries, but using similar statistical analyses. So I think you mentioned something about this earlier. What is your position on repetition of other experiments, replication? So in your case, how important, if say an RCT has been done in one context, how do you assess the contribution of a replication of that same RCT, maybe the same intervention, but in a different context or country?
So as I was saying earlier, I think it's not sufficient to just repeat or just replicate in another country exactly the same things. There has to be some reflection on why, let's say, the results might differ or the results might be the same. In fact, the choice of the other country, the choice of the context that's being analyzed is itself telling about whether the authors have reflected enough on the importance of the context to the results that's being discovered. So it's very important to actually to give some reason for the choice of the country, and then if you get different or similar results, to also reflect on that. So it's not sufficient to just, because it's not our journal, it's not a replication journal. I think there are outlets for replication work. And so that's where authors who decided to just replicate something should go. But our journal is really more about understanding the development process through impact evaluation.
Yeah,
Excuse me, I'm going to turn on the lights because we're losing sunlight. Oh no, the sun is playing with us here. Excuse me.
Yeah. You know, speaking of sun, so the sun is just rising here in California, so I'm watching the sunrise out my window just to give you a sense of place. One thing, Mark asked a question here about, and it's something I mentioned, so I'll just comment on this. He asked, what's the difference between a well-written thesis chapter and a journal article? And I guess, I mentioned something about that, so I'll just try to clarify. What I meant by that is that, you know, I mean, one part that is often clear to me that sort of distinguishes that gives away a submission as sort of a lightly edited, lightly revised thesis chapter is usually that there's usually a lengthy discussion of methods that about regression or about TOBIT or about, you know, some probit estimator, and then often the lit review often kind of gives it away as well, because a lit review in a thesis, you know, when a student's still trying to kind of learn how to pull together a lit review, often they kind of sprawl over many pages, and it's a little bit of a catalog of like, then this author did this, and then this author they did, and so et al. In '99 did that, and it comes across as a little bit of a catalog, a full inventory of people who've done any work related. So those are the two places where I see, you know, a paper needs to be much more concise and kind of move on with the narrative, right? I mean, it's like you want those the lit review to kind of be woven into the storyline in a way that is not like, it's not like, okay, now here's the sort of inventory of related work. Same with the methods, right? I mean, it's sort of knowing the audience well enough, knowing the kind of papers that are published, who the readers are in that journal, gives you a sense of how much detail you need to include on the methods. And sometimes just mentioning this is what you're doing is enough, and you don't need a paragraph talking about what assumptions about the error term are necessary for that to be the appropriate estimator. So Mark asks another question that maybe I'll just throw out there to you. This is a very minor point, but can be an important one, which is, how important is it that authors submitting a manuscript write a cover letter to you? And does what they write in the cover letter to you, the editor, does it change the way that you handle the paper, the submission?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, usually to me, it doesn't matter, because I have to go and read the paper first, right? So you can explain it to me in the cover letter, but still I have to go back and read and try to make a sense out of that, because there's a whole lot in the cover letter and I want to see exactly what it is. So, but in some cases nowadays, the authors don't even submit cover letters. They just become too emboldened, like, let the review process work out. I think they just assume that the editor doesn't even look at the cover letter. Sometimes you're searching for the cover letter and there's nothing, there's no blank files in there. So it's important to write a cover letter, and don't try to push that, oh, these could be potential reviewers in the cover letter, because I'm not going to go to those suggested one anyways. And regardless of what you say in the cover letter, is just makes your point that why I should read myself read the paper and then go through that. But still, I'm going to read the paper.
Lawrence or Elizabeth, any different thoughts about the cover letter?
Yeah, I don't think it replaces, sorry, Elizabeth, I don't think it replaces the reading of the paper, but it already shows that authors are making an effort to show why the paper is relevant for the journal. So authors who don't submit cover letters often haven't thought about, or not as explicitly, why this is relevant. It's kind of it's an extra. It helps me in making a decision. It can also show already they know what the state of the art is. They know to which journal they're submitting their paper. So I do find it helpful, but it doesn't replace the reading. So after looking at the cover letter, if it's still a badly written paper, the cover letter won't save it, so to say.
Elizabeth?
No, I have nothing to add. Those are great points. Thank you.
Okay. So let's shift to statistical significance. All three of you handle papers that are probably more likely to be quantitative than qualitative. So for an empirical analysis, how important is statistical significance in the way that you or the reviewers you enlist evaluate a paper? Let's start, Elizabeth. In yours. I think that must be. And you mentioned something before, but
Yes.
Talk a little bit about how you see statistical significance.
Yes. So some people think, some scholars now think that they should not publish a paper where they did not find a significant positive impact of a program, policy, or project. And I think that's wrong. The technical quality of the statistical analysis should be really robust, but a non-significant result is a result. And we want to know, in fact, sort of when we break myths about a program or policy, that's quite interesting, right? And if they tell us the story why they did not find, why they think there was no result, either weak implementation of the project or a policy, or because the design was flawed, there were spillovers or contagions from the treatment group to outside. Those are important things to discuss and to explain in the analysis. And also something that not all authors do is to say something about the sampling. What is the sampling design? How do they choose? How do they choose that? Tell us a little bit more about that, whether in the text or in a footnote would be very useful. But the reviewer and the editor want to know what's behind the study, and to be able to explain that in as succinct and rich way as possible is a challenge to many authors. They're either too close or they don't know enough themselves, and that's something we want to know.
Yeah, good. Ashok or Lawrence, any other reflections on statistical significance in the review process? Ashok, okay.
I'm fine.
So one thing I'll just point out, and this would actually be a segue to one other question I'll put to you, Lawrence. In the kind of the back and forth between that the editor is essentially mediating between the reviewers and the authors. I have found myself on occasion, and actually this follows on the statistical significance discussion. There are I think an increasing number of journals who write explicitly on their kind of journal aims and scope. They will include something about not being not being opposed to publishing null results. And so I know many journals are starting to make that clear, like we welcome null results, and then as you said, Elizabeth, we really want to see papers where the null result, an informative null result, can be really useful. But for it to be informative, you have to know kind of where that null result's coming from, and you have to be able to trust the design and the statistical power of the study, and so it has to be like to be useful. A null result can't just be any old null result, right? Because there's a lot of different ways you can get a null result. So I found myself on occasion, this is often like at the second round revision, resubmission, actually writing in my letter to authors saying, look, I'm happy to accept a paper that has null results. I want you to run these additional tests, and I don't care if they have stars on them, but I think it's important to be able to tell the full story and get a full sense of what's going on. So I would almost make a pre-commitment to being, willing to publish null results, just so that the authors didn't feel paralyzed by insignificance. So let me broaden that a little bit in the question I'll ask you, Lawrence, which is how, when you're giving direction to authors and you're kind of you're helping them to make sense of what's in a review report, do you ever instruct authors to not worry about a specific suggestion from a reviewer? How do you see your role as like helping the author to place a weight on how important it is that they do X, Y, or Z, or how important it is that they do the robustness test that this reviewers, I mean, do you give them specific guidance on how they should think about and process the feedback they get in a review?
Gee, that's a difficult question, because in terms of the JEE, that's often the work of the handling editors, who already kind of pre-select and give directions on that. And at Agricultural Systems, I haven't yet come to this situation that I had to do this, but I'm quite convinced that I will do this if I think it will really help authors. What I do say is that if they're clearly contrasting reviews, for example, major revision and a minor revision, I will say pay particular attention to this, or don't go crazy on this. Do address it, but it's not necessary to do it to the full extent the reviewer asked, also because other people they say no, it's okay. So yes, I do try to help them, but that's particularly in terms of contrasting reviews. I do help them to navigate those reviews and to seek a middle way, and I think that's also very helpful. I remember my first paper I ever sent as a PhD student, the editor did that, and it was really helpful. He basically said, yeah, it's a good review, the more critical review, but don't take it seriously, but don't make it too big, because I also think it's a good paper. But I do think that requires that you have affinity with the paper. You can't do that for all papers, and then you also would need to rely on maybe an additional advice or asking for a third review. And I think that is something that's sometimes problematic in the current times of overburdened reviewers, that you actually need to seek that third review, but you can't find anybody. And I think that is something we still should try to do in some of these cases.
Yeah, good. Let's shift. There's a couple of questions we received that are about the pandemic, and how the pandemic has affected things. And there's two different questions here, and I'll just sort of float these out to any one of you who wants to respond. One of those questions is about research about COVID-19 and impacts of the pandemic. So what do you see? You know, are you starting to see submissions, or what do you anticipate in your respective journals about, you know, changing the actual substance of the submissions that you get, the topics, the questions that you see? And then the other is about whether the pandemic is affecting the kind of the editorial process, peer review, delays, anything on kind of the operational side of journals. On those two questions, any COVID-19 reflections on the editorial process?
I haven't seen I haven't seen submissions yet that reflect on that include the COVID-19. However, I think it would be very interesting, actually, given that we're interested in impact evaluations. There are many different kinds of approaches that countries are doing to deal with it. So hopefully in the future, we will get some really thoughtful and rigorous papers on the pandemic. In terms of the reviewers, only one of the reviewers whom I had been in touch with told me about issues he has with the pandemic, which is his family, and therefore his review was not going to come on in a timely manner. But that was only one reviewer.
Yeah. Okay. Lorenz or Ashok, any pandemic reflections?
So I think Agricultural Economics International is publishing a special issue on COVID that is, I think, with IFPRI, I guess so. IFPRI authors and Tom Reardon, I guess they are doing the special issue, and I think most of the journals are doing the special issue. So we have that one coming in, and as far as reviewers, they have been doing a fantastic job. I'm averaging about 80 days now. So first some reviews coming back on paper. So I think COVID has somehow helped us to increase the speed of returns. So hopefully this is for good, but we'll see.
So you mentioned.
at the same time, then the authors are also submitting more papers.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's what I was going to say. I think in the next 6 months or 8 months, there will be a bit of a logjam of new submissions, and I think some journals have already seen that. And it's not just because COVID-19 has opened has kind of opened new territory for questions related to public health or impact of restrictions and lockdowns, but also just because all of us have had a little bit more time to work on papers that have long been on our desk but just haven't gotten pushed off. And so I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I think in the next 6 months, I'm imagining most editors will be receiving a bit of a surge of their own, a surge in submissions rather than a surge of coronavirus cases. But so you mentioned, Ashok, the time in review. One very simple question, and I'll just go around to each of you. How long after a submission is received is it, in your view, appropriate for an author to follow up with you as editor and say, can you give me an update on when I should find out about this paper? Is that so in months? Is that 4 months, 5 months, 6 months? Like how long after the paper is received is that appropriate? Elizabeth?
I would say, okay, we give about 5 to 6 weeks for the review process. Certainly, very few reviewers actually make that, and a couple have surprised me by turning in their reports in fewer weeks than 5 weeks. But I think, and authors also can go on the sites, journal site, to check where their papers are. Mm-hmm. So they don't necessarily have to write me, but I have had authors who have written, and I think 4-5 months. I would not be, after they've submitted the paper, I will not be annoyed about an email nudging the paper.
Mm-hmm. Lawrence?
Well, we are nudged by the systems. We get red flags and that kind of stuff. So we do our best to move it through the system as quick as possible. I think what Elizabeth said, it's important that authors check the system, because then they can see where it is. So if it moves from like with editor to under review, then wait for a bit to inquire. It typically takes 4 or 5 weeks. But for me, it's very fine that authors ask after 6 weeks, after it has entered into review, what's happening. I don't mind, because I can then say, yeah, we got one in, but the other one's still out. Be patient. I think they have a right to do so, but they should also be aware that reviewers do this voluntarily. All kinds of stuff may happen which delays it. We as editors, we're trying our best to chase them up, so to say, if we don't get it back. But we should not forget this is a voluntary process. I also now sometimes see it with journals that they have moved to 2-week return for reviews. I now tend to decline them and say, if you want that, then you should start seeing it as a profession, and most of them don't want that. So I decline those. So I think that the publishers should be realistic about what they ask from people, a voluntary contribution, and we all do this because we see that this is a process of kind of mutual effort. But it should be reasonable, because we have other stuff on our plate as well, teaching, etc. So yeah,
that's a good point. I would just underscore that for the audience, that it's very important to think about the public good aspect of peer review and publication. Right, there's a really important public goods problem here, and so being aware of the system is you'll be asked to review papers. And your contributions as a reviewer are what give you reviews when you submit a paper on the author side, and so it really does take a kind of a collective commitment to the public good to make this system work. We have just another last minute or two, and I just wanted to throw one more question out before we wrap up. I'll pass it back to Ruth in just a moment. And the question is, about kind of early career scholars, maybe scholars, non-native English speakers, those from developing countries. So authors who in those categories, is there anything in the editorial process or the peer review process that that you think specifically that is designed to help those kinds of authors find their way to publishing in your journals? Is there, or do you have any advice for them? I mean, we talked a bit about English writing. I mean, if English is the language of exposition, but any other reflections on early career scholars, maybe from developing countries, reflections on the quality of submissions you receive?
Well, I think what I mentioned before, think about where you want to publish, what you want to publish before you start with your study. Don't see it as something you do afterwards. I often see that as happening. It's a reflection, but also in terms of how are we helping authors. Read editorials about common mistakes in the publishing process. My journal, JEE, has done that often. If I look at the aims and scope of both JEE and agricultural systems, they really denote really well what do they want, what do they don't want. So read those before you submit, or before you make a journal choice. They are there to orient you, and I think that often, that doesn't happen, or doesn't happen sufficiently.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so our journal, the Journal of Development Effectiveness, has a page to help authors with preparing a paper. But and of course the other things that we've talked about today are also very important for us as guidelines for authors. But let me just add a couple of things. So one is that the choice of journal is very important. So I think we talked about the sort of the randomness of being able to publish, but actually the key one part of that is actually choosing the right journal. So choosing the right fit for your paper is a very important part of publishing, and then trying to understand what that journal wants, right? And one of the things that I do as an editor is I actually, if I get papers that seem like they're promising, but they're not the right fit for my journal, I even suggest, especially if I think they're young scholars, I make suggestions of some journals that they might want to try. So just as a way to help them. But I think that really being thoughtful about transforming, let's say, a dissertation chapter into a journal paper, the things that Ashok was mentioning and Lawrence was mentioning, I think those are very important things for young scholars to think about. Technical quality, more than sort of gaming who's on the editorial board, etc., is going to pay off more.
Yeah, excellent. Ashok, any last words?
I totally agree with all those points made there, and the paramount thing is just write the best paper to the right journal and follow through. And if you send me an email about your paper status, I always respond. I can look at it, but just give the editors 100 days. For me, it's 100 days. If you have seen more than 100 days, call me.
Yeah, good.
So all those add up.
Thank you, Ashok. So with that, thank you so much, Elizabeth, Lawrence, Ashok, for your time this evening, wherever you are. Thank you for your insights and your reflections.